What does this mean for economic policy? Well, I think it potentially has important implications for the judgment that the Reserve Bank has to make as to how long it keeps its official cash rate at the current record low levels. The Reserve Bank has been pretty clear that it thinks it should keep the cash rate at the current record low levels until the labour market is sufficiently tight, or to put it differently, the unemployment rate is sufficiently low to generate wages growth that's sufficiently strong to push the underlying rate of consumer price inflation sustainably into the 2 to 3% range. Now, the Reserve Bank says they're no longer sure, as they used to be, how tight the labour market needs to be, how low the unemployment rate needs to get before wages growth starts to move more strongly than it has done over the last 5 years. They used to think that that threshold was an unemployment rate of about 5%. And they used to say that they needed to tighten monetary policy before unemployment actually got to that level of about 5%, because there were lags between the state of the labour market and movements in wage inflation, and between changes in interest rates and the things that drive the state of the labour market. So they used to say that they needed to tighten monetary policy preemptively based on their staff forecasts of what inflation was going to do over the next year or so. But because those staff forecasts of inflation picking up turned out to be so wrong for so long, the Reserve Bank's lost confidence in that, and it now says that they're going to wait and see inflation of both wages and prices rise before they draw any conclusions about whether the labour market is sufficiently tight to induce upward movements in wage and price inflation. They're going to, as Deputy Governor Guy Debelle says, be guided by the lived experience of inflation rather than by their own staff's forecasts of what inflation might be about to do. And I think they're entirely reasonable to take that position. It's consistent with the stance that's taken by other central banks, including the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and others. But the Reserve Bank's actually gone further than most other central banks by putting a date on how long it thinks interest rates should remain at record low levels. Most other central banks have satisfied themselves with phrases like, it will take patience and time, or it will take a long time before the conditions that justify moving away from record low interest rates will be satisfied. But the Reserve Bank, since the beginning of this year, has said that's 2024 at the earliest. What we see other central banks now beginning to do is to nominate dates at which they will begin to raise rates. Brazil and Russia have already done that 3 times at their last 3 meetings. In the advanced economy world, Norway has signaled that it might start raising rates in the second half of this year. Canada and New Zealand have said that they will start raising rates as they now see things in the second half of 2022. And the Federal Reserve last week surprised markets by saying that they now expect that there'll be 2 increases in the Fed's federal funds rate, their equivalent of our cash rate, in the year 2023. My sense is that because the unemployment rate is falling much more rapidly than the Reserve Bank had previously thought, and that in turn is in large part because of the way in which border closures are both boosting domestic spending and speeding the rate at which the unemployment rate falls, the Reserve Bank might have to start raising rates before 2024 at the earliest, contrary to their guidance over the last 6 months. And indeed, the Reserve Bank might already have started to lay the groundwork for shifting its guidance about the timing of the first rate rise, with Governor Lowe's speech in Toowoomba last week, where for the first time since February, he didn't use the phrase 2024 at the earliest, but rather seemed to be hinting that at next month's board meeting, when the Reserve Bank will be making some important decisions about its bond purchase programs, it might change the advice that it's previously given as to when the first rate rise will occur. For my part, I've been thinking for a while that the first rate rise may occur in the first half of 2023. I noticed that one of Australia's major banks went even further than that this week by suggesting that it could be the second half of 2022. I think that's a bit premature, but I'm increasingly convinced that the Reserve Bank is going to have to explain to people why the advice they'd previously given about 2024 at the earliest may need to be revised. More broadly, the point I want to make, consistent with the title of this webinar, is that the protracted closure of Australia's international borders increasingly looks to me like a form of protectionism. What I mean by that is that the protectionism that Australia practiced from the time of Federation, when Victoria, as the strongest colony at that time, imposed its economic development model on the rest of the country. From then until the early 1990s, when we started to walk away from that, protectionism in Australia used tariffs and quotas to force Australians to spend money which they would have preferred to spend on foreign-made goods, such as textiles, household equipment, and most obviously motor vehicles, if they'd been free to do so, instead on Australian-produced goods. And the belief was that that created jobs, especially in manufacturing industry. It reduced our dependence on agriculture and mining, and it enhanced our resilience to external shocks, including in particular the possibility that was a real life experience during the First and Second World Wars, that our supply chains for so-called strategic goods could be interrupted by things such as war. And that, of course, was very popular. Other advanced economies began to wind back their barriers to trade in manufactured goods after World War II under the auspices of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT as it was called, the predecessor to what's now the World Trade Organization. Uniquely among advanced economies, Australia and New Zealand refused to dismantle their barriers to trade in manufactured goods, largely because other advanced economies wouldn't do the same to their barriers to trade in agricultural commodities, which still represented the bulk of Australia's and New Zealand's exports. Of course, economists at the time pointed out that this was the equivalent of Australia and New Zealand saying to other countries, if you continue to shoot yourself in the foot, we'll continue to do the same. And that's unfortunately what we did until the 1980s. The end result of Australia's persistence with high levels of protection for its manufacturing industries was that both those manufacturing industries and the economy more broadly became increasingly inefficient as productivity growth lagged behind the rates achieved in other advanced economies, which were more open to competition from abroad. And the end result of that was that our per capita GDP, which is a crude but widely used measure of material living standards, declined from being, along with New Zealand and Argentina, just about the highest in the world at the time of Federation, to, by the early 1990s, being 26th in the world. I'm arguing that our border closures during COVID, which, as I've explained, have been more comprehensive and in place for longer than in any other democracy, have much more in common with Australia's earlier forms of protectionism. They're in effect forcing Australians to spend at home on goods money which they would have preferred, if they'd been free to do so, to spend overseas on services. And they're reducing the competition which Australians looking for work face from foreigners, in this particular case, immigrants. In other words, the effect of our protracted border closures are exactly the same in principle and in many ways in practice as the protectionism which Australia practiced for 90 years after we became an independent nation at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, again, I emphasize that those border closures were initially for good reasons, to suppress the virus at a time when there was no other alternative to keeping Australians safe from a disease which would kill them. I'm not suggesting that we should have done other than that, at least as far as inward arrivals are concerned, although I've always struggled to understand how preventing Australians from leaving the country, as long as you require them to quarantine if they return, how preventing Australians from leaving the country helps keep Australians safe from the virus. All it does is reduce the amount that the government has to spend or require people to spend themselves on hotel quarantine, and allow the government to ignore recommendations from specialists like Jane Holton that we should be doing more of that sort. as the government has been unwilling to do. But the other point is that now that there are alternatives available, which other countries are more successfully implementing than we are to vaccinate a sufficiently large proportion of their population, the persistence of this form of protectionism provides a short-term sugar hit to the economy, but the longer we persist with it, the more likely it is to result in the same sort of consequences that the old form of protectionism did. And just to illustrate that point, this chart shows 150 years of Australia's and, as a comparator, New Zealand's per capita GDP as a proportion of the United States. As I mentioned, at the time of Federation, Australia had one of the highest living standards in the world, as measured by per capita GDP, as did New Zealand. But in part, and I'm not suggesting this is the only reason, but in part because from the time of Federation until the late 1980s, we increasingly insulated ourselves from the internationalization of our economy that most other advanced economies pursued after the end of the Second World War. We progressively slipped behind. And you can see that after the early 1990s, when we essentially gave up that misguided form of protectionism and started focusing on the things that we do well, the things in which we have a comparative advantage, we recouped a great deal of the loss in our relative standard of living that we'd suffered over the previous 90 years. Poor New Zealand hasn't been able to do as well in that regard, partly, of course, because they haven't benefited from the mining boom in the way that Australia has done. But nonetheless, New Zealand's slide down the ladders of countries ranked by living standards, which had been much worse than ours, at least was arrested as a result of New Zealand also abandoning its forms of protectionism from the late 1980s onwards. All of this really underscores the point that if we're to return to the sorts of economic growth that we had pre-COVID, particularly in the absence of population growth, we're going to have to do much better with regard to improving productivity than we've been doing in the years immediately before the onset of COVID. This chart disaggregates the growth rate of Australia's real GDP into the contributions from labour supply, that is hours worked, which is in turn the product of the number of people working and changes in average hours worked on the one hand, and what people produce for each hour that they work, otherwise known as labour productivity, on the other. And the key point here is that between the end of the early 90s recession and the onset of the global financial crisis in 2008, more than half the growth in Australia's real GDP came from productivity growth, and just under half of it from increases in labour supply, more people or more hours. By contrast, from the end of the mining boom around 2015 until the onset of COVID, barely more than a quarter of the growth in our economy came from increases in productivity, and nearly 3/4 of it came from increases in labour supply, more people working longer hours. All the evidence from economic theory and from economic study shows, as Paul Krugman famously said nearly 30 years ago, that although productivity isn't everything, in the long run, it's nearly everything. And as Michael Brennan, the new chairman of the Productivity Commission, reminded people just over 2 weeks ago, it's the only sustainable source of improvements in real wages and in living standards. And unless we can find ways of improving productivity that inevitably will be different from the ways that we were able to improve it in the late 1990s, because most of those reforms can't be repeated. You can't pick the same low-hanging fruit twice. But unless we find other ways of boosting productivity, then we're going to have another pretty ordinary period of economic growth like the 5 years we had before the onset of COVID, once we get back to whatever the post-COVID normal is. And unfortunately, the only government in the country that seems to get that point and seems willing to talk about and implement productivity enhancing reform is the New South Wales government, which in its budget earlier this week did have a number of important productivity enhancing initiatives that they either foreshadowed or continued with, as with their proposed reform of the property taxation system. Unfortunately, no other government in Australia, irrespective of its political persuasion, seems willing to grasp the nettle of productivity growth in the way that New South Wales does. And unless that changes after forthcoming elections, then I think the outlook for Australia post-COVID is not going to be any brighter than it was in the years immediately before COVID. And in particular, the superior economic performance that Australia has been able to demonstrate over the past year compared with our peer group of advanced economies at the moment. Thank you very much for allowing me to share all those thoughts with you. Now, let me turn it over to questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. Rati, I'm not sure whether you've picked up any questions from people or if people want to put them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to respond to them.